everyone already knows what Resident Evil is. It's a classic that can be played on a million different systems and was re-released a bunch on the original PlayStation alone. But what's odd is the original polygonal version has largely fallen by the wayside. There's a remake, which, don't get me wrong, is an amazing game and would be on anyone's shortlist of best video game remakes, including mine, but it's still not my favourite version of Resident Evil 1. I always preferred the blockier, cheesier charm of the original, complete with a wide variety of colours instead of just brown and greyish brown. And whenever I need my hit of this game, I always come running to Deadly Silence, the version exclusive to the Nintendo DS. Yet whenever I tell people this game came to DS, they're always surprised. It's flown under the radar, and I think a large part of it is that this is the PlayStation original, but released at a time when the GameCube remake was already a few years old, and Resident Evil 4 was the newest game in the series. It left a lot of people thinking of this game as a relic to time. Not only did it not play like a modern game, but it had terrible voice acting. It was a 10-year-old game that people were tired of, at a time when 10-year-old games were considered trash by a lot of people. But this was a great game, it was just released at the worst possible time. And since it's based around 2 screens, it meant it wouldn't see a re-release, unless they pull a Rayman 2 and put the same game on DS and 3DS. And now that games are back to single screens, why would they redo this DS game, when it's a lot easier to work with the one-screen versions of this game? So yeah, that's a lot of ways to say this game was ignored then, and still ignored now. Before venturing into the game proper, we have an options screen I recommend going to first, to enable the red blood, because this game keeps defaulting to green, which I find silly. Upon booting up the game, we're greeted by a small, yet substantial quality of life improvement. It straight up tells us Chris's campaign is hard mode. This wasn't present in earlier releases, which meant you could be like me and first play the game as the default character who was on the box art of some releases. How foolish. First time players should instead play as the other character, who is now properly labelled as normal mode. Both campaigns are largely the same, but with enough interesting changes. Chris has an inventory of 6 items, and Jill can carry 8. So by default, things are more infuriating with the large man, who has pockets, because he can't carry much somehow. Jill benefits also from being the master of locks, so she can unlock some doors earlier than Chris can, and she doesn't need a key to unlock these small little chests. Though to compensate, Chris has more health than Jill, so he's not always the worst character. Now, a lot of people know that to properly play this game, you need to play it twice, once as each character to get the full picture. But people who say that are wrong, because this version wants you to play it 4 times. I sure did. I now see this game in my sleep and it's inescapable. Because here we have classic vanilla mode, and an exciting DS exclusive mode I'll touch on as it comes up. But for now, we're going to be boring and pick standard mode. Things start off exactly as you'd expect, but it's noticeably crunchier. The full motion video stuff has been rendered to the best of the DS's capabilities, which is to say it looks poor, but the visual sacrifices do extend to the main game too. Okay, well to be fair, they don't really on the original DS hardware. That thing had a poor screen at first, so much like some early releases on the Game Boy Advance, this game was made with visuals to compensate the poor screen. When played on the original model, this game looks great. The problem is most people won't play this game on that. I've slightly adjusted my footage to better sell this game, because if I return the brightness and contrast back to their defaults, it just looks too bright and overblown. So in most video footage, or an emulator, or even later iterations of a DS or 3DS, this game becomes an overly bright mess. It looks like someone got pre-rendered pictures and cranked up every slider they could. I know this footage here isn't ideal and my DS has dead pixels, but here is the same area in both the original DS and again on new 3DS. You can see the difference. I must stress this isn't an issue the devs could have really worked around, and it's not a fault of the game as a game. It's just something that happens to tarnish its legacy. Not surprisingly, the original PlayStation version is still unmatched to me in terms of visuals. That had a stronger atmosphere, and while this doesn't match that, even on the original DS, this still does look pretty good considering the hardware and the time it released. Though something that does hinder the tone, though to some I guess it's a quality of life improvement, is that items glow so you shouldn't miss any. I don't mind this, but I can see it bugging people a lot. And on the topic of visuals, they updated Chris and Jill to look more modern. They're alright, though I mostly love them because when they're far away from their camera, their faces become pixelated messes, and I find that funny because I'm a child. Something minor that is adjusted thanks to the resolution here is that all the notes in the game are given way more pages with less text on each. It's not a big deal, it's just a neat consequence of the hardware. But to get back to the game, either Jill, Barry and Wesker, or Chris, Jill and Wesker run to safety inside a mansion after being attacked outside. All of this while on their mission to find lost teammates from their elite special forces operation. They can't just open the door and leave. They're basically trapped in an inhospitable mansion that is filled with infected people who are basically zombies and a wider variety of monsters that lie in wait. It's easy to see why this game was a scary and tense game to audiences in the late 90s. Though thanks to how tame this game is today, it's lost some of that allure, especially on this bright DS version. There's a reason they remade this game to be scarier. But to me, Resident Evil 1 is two different games. It's a slow and frightening horror game, but it's also a fast-paced game about replaying for better times. And that second reason is why this DS version is my baby. The horror can only last so long, but you can always play it over and over to get better results, and this version facilitates that the best. Though to get the obvious part of the way, part of the reason that the horror hasn't stuck is the infamous voice acting here.
Whoa! This hall is dangerous!
It's no use. The roots of it are in the basement. You can... Whoa!
Chris!
Stop it! Don't open that door!
Look, I love this. This is how the characters will always sound to me. And while I know it's very cheesy, I'm still a big fan. It's just so endearing. Thankfully, this game reused the original game's voices, though in a few small moments they did have to re-record new audio with sound-alikes.
I got your back.
Got it.
Okay.
That's for the new content which I'll tackle as it comes up. But I'm glad they did this approach. I could see a version of this game where it's all re-recorded, and that's more frightening than the game itself. Embrace the original delivery. This also applies to the Japanese release, which is still English but with Japanese subtitles.
Wow! What a mansion!
And on that, this game has subtitles in general, even if you're playing the English release. From what I can tell, and I expect to be proven wrong in the comments, Deadly Silence was the first time Resident Evil 1 had subtitles. Not even the fancy GameCube remake did, though later iterations of that would. Regardless of pedantics, this version does have subtitles, and it's an overall plus. More people can enjoy these strangely worded lines. But to get back to the game part of the game, Jill and Chris each explore the mansion on their own, with occasional meetups with others trapped here too, namely Barry and Rebecca. There is an order to everything here. It's easy to split the adventure into multiple distinct parts, though each of these chunks has quite a bit of freedom in the exact sequence you do things, especially with Jill early on, who can lockpick some doors. There are even some small scenes that can be entirely different depending on what you did first. Nothing major, but a highlight to me that sticks out is that Jill can become a sandwich if you first saw Barry in a different room earlier. And on top of cool moments like that, it also means her journey to getting the shotgun is slightly longer. There are a few small deviations like this, though it's mostly for extra dialogue and nothing that really impacts gameplay. And for those of you sinners that hate this dialogue, Deadly Silence lets you skip cutscenes. I want to act all high and mighty and say I could never do that, but I still did skip them. Look, I played this game a lot for this video, even I have my limits. In fact, impatience doesn't just limit itself to voices, but the iconic sequences where we see a door open, or other similar transitions, can now be skipped. I know this is sacrilege to some, they're part of what makes the original Resident Evil be Resident Evil. But they were a way to mask loading, which isn't needed on the cartridge, so we now get the option to skip it and get back to playing. And if you have patience and don't want to skip it for the sake of purity, you don't have to. Everyone wins. Things start off simple. It's just a mansion with oddly specific keys and puzzles, and there are zombies and dogs that you can't pet that repeatedly try to attack you. It eases you gently with a fantastic difficulty curve. For a while, it'll just be a basic handgun, which is a good starter weapon. It's not good for anything beyond these small threats, but we also have a knife for when we want to conserve ammo or have none at all to spare. Not surprisingly, ammo isn't super plentiful, but the knife here is arguably the biggest change in this dual screen release. Wait, no, actually the dual screen is. We get a map on top at all times, and it flashes different colours to show our health. And the flashing was way less obnoxious on the original 2004 model of the DS. But the knife is still up there as a huge change. In other releases of the game, the knife is something you must pause the game to equip, and then you attack it as you would a gun. It became time consuming to keep switching between knife and gun, which disincentivized using it. But thanks to this releasing after Resident Evil 4, the devs took inspiration from that and gave us a knife button. The left shoulder button is dedicated to the knife. Regardless of which weapon we have equipped, we can just knife away. It's so satisfying to shoot a zombie until they fall down, and then do a quick knifing on their body without switching weapons. And this has a ripple effect. The knife no longer takes up an inventory slot, whereas it would have before, so it's effectively like having an extra slot. The knife also sees a lot of use in the DS exclusive Rebirth mode. This is basically this game's version of the Arrange mode of before. For the uninitiated, Director's Cut on PlayStation added a new optional mode which changed up the balance, camera angles, the map, as well as completely adding new sections and rearranging others. It was a great way to justify selling the game again, and it was a fun way to replay Resident Evil when you wanted a slight twist to it. Rebirth followed suit, but it has very specific goals. A lot less has been changed in some aspects, but at times this feels like an entirely different experience. The map is the same, and the general events you go through are largely identical with some exceptions, but the feel of the game is what changed. Here, the enemy spawns are all different, and best of all, we get multiple enemy types at a time. In the original game, and the classic mode emulating it here, you'll only have rooms of a single enemy type. Zombies won't be in rooms of dogs, for example, it'll be one or the other. But here in Rebirth, all that is thrown out the window. Enjoy the chaos of birds swooping down on you while you're trying to deal with zombies. No wonder these birds are on the Japanese cover, they're a big spread here now. But we also have dogs in the same rooms as other enemies, meaning when they jump through windows, it's much more of a shocking surprise. It's them doing that and overwhelming you. And late game enemies not only get involved with this, but they appear much earlier than they did before. These ceiling climbing freaks called Chimera are now in the main mansion itself, and they're first added with this wonderful scripted sequence showing their presence in the shadows. But I'm getting ahead of myself, but I do just have to note that on Rebirth, enemies sometimes, very rarely, but sometimes move much faster than you'd expect. And that's the thing. If they always moved fast, you could plan around that and always factor it in. But here, 99% of the time, they're regular slow-moving guys, but then they sprint and it's a bolt of excitement that panics you. For zombies it's hell, and for the giant spiders I hate it, it's terrifying. Whichever developer let these spiders sprint at you should be executed. This mode does do a lot to compensate it so it isn't misery, just a different form of chaos. For starters, enemies die a lot quicker than they did before, and we can even use the touchscreen to not only shake off enemies, but force them to the ground. Something I've never known about in all my years or these playthroughs that I recorded, because I didn't read every single page of this manual until the script was nearly done. That would have been great to know. But also present in both Rebirth and Classic mode, there are changes that are just universal, like a quick turnaround that wasn't featured until Resident Evil 3, or a quick reloading button, meaning you can always go into rooms topped up, especially now with the new HUD telling you how much ammo is in your clip, and the characters go into their aiming position much faster than they did before. Thankfully, this doesn't change how aiming a gun actually works. The deliberateness of it is still in place. It's just been sped up, which I can see the arguments against. But to me personally, very little has been sacrificed here. It still feels like Resident Evil 1, just with a slightly different flavour. I'll admit, giving you all these extra functions from later games does ruin the specific feel of this first game, as does the new HUD that removes any ambiguity. I won't fault people who specifically don't like these additions. I know I've been a weirdo purist on lots of games before, and I do still love the PlayStation version a lot. Even the one with the music that everyone hates. Also, yes, I know this game came out on PC and Saturn, but it's just easier to say PlayStation instead of saying those every single time. But there's a careful balancing act here to update a game like this without it losing its core appeal, and no matter what you do, it'll upset some people. But like I said earlier, to me personally, this passed the balancing act with flying colours. But a moment ago I described the game as having 2 modes, but that's technically a misnomer, because there is an easier difficulty here as well. It's based directly off one from the director's cut, but unlike that, this isn't readily available. Instead, it's found with a cheat code that was provided in the game's manual. With this, you get way more supplies, and enemies die more easily. It's a nice alternative if someone refuses to play this game any other way, but the large majority of players would ignore it, even if it was there on the menu. This training mode can be applied to both Classic and Rebirth, so players have a lot of different choices on how they want to play. Also, and god I keep going on weird tangents, but there's just so much going on here. Ink ribbons, the limited items that we get to save with, now come in bundles of 3 instead of 2. Originally I thought this was a quality of life improvement since it is a handheld game and people need to get off more often, but nah, it's cause the Japanese versions always did 3, it's just that it works very well on the DS now. Now, unless you're saving every time you get interrupted in a busy day, you'll have plenty of chances to save. So almost too many ink ribbons, since so many stacks of 3 does add up over the course of the game. Though at the risk of upsetting Resident Evil fans even more, I kinda wish the ink ribbons wouldn't take up inventory slots either, since almost every place you'll save is by a chest, and you'll keep your spare items in that. So it's usually just pointless busy work to retrieve ribbons from there and save in the same room. But I did say kind of wish, because I do recognize the intention here. With the knife being excluded from the inventory already, this extra step may have gone too far and snowballed into a game with way less tension or item management. I guess it's a choice between a minor annoyance and ruining the game's feel, and I suppose I'll let the hard-working developers and game designers have this win. They probably know more about game design than me, a person with 0 experience. But just to get back to the Japanese release having 3 ink ribbons, Deadly Silence as a whole is based on the Japanese version of Resident Evil, so it is largely an easier time. Saving wasn't the only thing changed in the Western releases. The original auto-aim was removed for the 90s Western players, but Deadly Silence has the auto-aim back, so it's just another in the sea of reasons why this game feels easier to speed on through, even if Japanese players wouldn't have noticed a difference. I'd be here all day if I discussed every single change, and I'd still forget some anyway since I'm not an encyclopedia of Resident Evil 1 knowledge. But to sum it up, it's very similar, but subtly different in a lot of ways, and that does add up. The game not asking you if you're sure every time you combine herbs means you can save valuable seconds across the entire game run. This monster-filled estate keeps surprising new players, even if most of it is just awkward hallways. They somehow manage to get the most out of that. These hallways are permanently etched into my brain. But beyond these long rooms, we get lots of remarkable set pieces, and simple puzzles that are incredibly memorable. They're just basically here to add more game to the game. Block moving puzzles make up a bunch of these, and while they're kind of repetitive, I can't imagine anything else better filling their time. This game can't just be shooting and running, and Rebirth mode shows us why we shouldn't strive for more. Because Rebirth isn't just a really cool way to change the enemies, it also adds lots of minigames. And while none of these are outright bad, at their best, these still feel like distractions that interrupt the game for no good reason. The most common of these is the first-person knife fights, and these might be my favourite in a vacuum. It's just that whenever I do them, I wish I could skip them. It's a cute novelty that uses the touchscreen very well, and it even shows us that hunters can be one-hit killed with a knife. There's some light strategy here with timing and the direction of your swipe, or even if you just want to stab instead. It is fun, which is why I'm glad this is available on its own as a high score challenge from the main menu. It's just during the game itself, I get very little actual enjoyment from it, and I wish the game would just let me go to rooms without this occasionally popping up. The new backgrounds are cool here though, and it lets us see these monsters up close, which is a fun novelty. But outside those, I dislike them being in the main game itself. Other than that, we get lots of extra puzzles that make use of the touchscreen, all with varying levels of quality, and there's even some microphone-based minigames which I kind of find funny. We do CPI here. That's so weird, I kind of respect it. But all of these things I'd rather not have, and I know they'll discourage me from playing Rebirth mode more often, because honestly, without these, if it was just the enemy and balance stuff, I'd say it's the far more engaging mode. But Rebirth has high highs, even if it stumbles quite a bit. At least we have darts, which factually does make every game that has it better, especially with Jill and Chris's voice lines.
Yeah, bullseye, baby!
Hell yeah!
It doesn't take long to explore all you can of what's immediately available. So it'll be on to the first boss fight, a giant snake who is probably on the more difficult end of bosses here, and he's not even that hard at all. Though if you're bitten, you'll succumb to poison, which is a neat twist. And if you're playing as Chris, no you're not, because now you're playing as Rebecca. She'll become your new character for a few minutes as she runs to the other room to get the antidote. There isn't really much to say about Rebecca, except it's neat that Chris's campaign has a few optional moments where you play as someone who can help him. We can see this again with another boss fight later in the game too. Whenever Jill needs help, she gets it from Barry, who isn't playable because we don't deserve to play as Barry. He was too cool for us, emphasis on was. By the time we get to this big sneaky boy who is trying his best to be rendered on the DS, the player should have both a handgun and a shotgun. I'm sure you don't need me explaining the differences, but I'll just add that I love the weapon scaling here. Between those and a Magnum we get very late game, we have a wonderful trio of main weapons, with more power but less common ammunition. It really makes you save your more powerful guns until you can afford to use them more often. The time they're introduced to you, and the location of the ammo pickups, is really purposeful in delivering the specific feeling the developers wanted. Also, there are a few extra weapons like a rocket launcher or a bazooka or a flamethrower, and they're all great, but I specified main weapons because the handgun, shotgun, and magnum are what the game is largely about. These guns have a lot of impact. The sound design is phenomenal, and combined with the enemy grunts and screams, it really helps feed into this perfect balance of horror and power fantasy. The second chapter of the game sees us in the guardhouse outside the main mansion. It adds lots of surprises, including the spiders I hate. And also, this isn't until much later in the game, but I will personally murder whichever developer put a spider in this closet in Rebirth mode. It just falls on you whenever you enter. Thanks for that. Also, on Rebirth mode, the developers had a lot of fun, because there's a bathtub here that you drain and a zombie pops out of it. That's a really cool twist that doesn't make me want to die. Other than spiders, we get more additions like this annoying vine, these wasps, and these water creatures called Neptune, which become silly little flopping guys when the water is drained. Someone put an extra one outside in Rebirth mode just because it was funny. This whole area is a nice escalation in combat difficulty, and its tight and claustrophobic nature, being a really small side house, does help it from taking too long or dragging down the pace. It's a reprieve from wandering aimlessly through the estate, and it's just here to make sure you're ready for when you go back. The overall momentum of this game is excellent, since these chapters all have their own unique feeling and atmosphere, as well as pacing that each fly by without ever feeling too quick. The Rebirth mode developers did do a dick move here, but it's kind of funny. even if it was just here to make players more miserable. Normally there is a button in this room that drains the water, something you need to do to progress. But here in Rebirth, all it does is poison the water, and then you have to do a touchscreen minigame to drain the water after that. It's a fun way to mess with expectations, but also, like most of what I think about Rebirth mode, kinda wish it wasn't there. A cool addition that this mode adds is some new camera angles. These are few and far between. It's not the director's cut arranged mode, which basically went overboard for the sake of it. Here they're done very tastefully, like this one showing the wasp hive from underneath for a moment. Or my personal favourite, this one that shows a close-up of the door you entered, but there's a new mirror here that specifically shows the zombie walking towards you. What a creative way to make new angles feel substantial. I'm torn because I kind of want more of these, but they're also great because it's done so sparingly. After another boss fight, this time with a giant plant, which also gives us more time as Rebecca if we're playing as Chris, we finally meet up again with Wesker, the awesome looking guy from the beginning of the game who vanished early on. He's here to remind us of the plot and to guide us back to the original mansion again. On the surface it feels like a simple retread, but this familiar locale has been infested with hunters, these gigantic green beasts, that are a much bigger threat than anything we've seen thus far. They're introduced with this sublime first-person cutscene of one running up to the location that you're at, and they continue to be a threat for a large portion of the remaining game. On Rebirth mode, we don't just have them here, we get little sleeping puppies. Also the chimeras I mentioned earlier are introduced here, and these are dangerous creatures. But the point of this retread is to see all the rooms we never got to explore previously, including the basement and all the rooms connected to it. It's a sizable chunk of the mansion, even if it's mostly tucked away in a seemingly small portion of the map. This is where, to me, the game hits its highest highs, on both modes. Balance feels like it's at its best for the most part, and this is still before the game becomes a bit too easy with the Magnum. We even get another fight with the giant snake, or for Rebirth players, 2 more fights with him, because there's some new content here. It's small scale, but there's an extra note guiding us back to the guardhouse once more, where we get to fight this beast once again. Except for maximum gimmick value, it's a knife fight in first person. It's genuinely really cool they made a boss out of this mode, even if it stretches credulity. It feels a lot more fun when you do the knife minigame on its own, with this acts as the final boss. Also, while specifically talking about Rebirth, it did 2 other really cool things in this portion of the game specifically. One time there is a door with a sword sticking out of it, and it's a silly touchscreen fest where we pull the sword out, only to see the zombie on the other side fall to the ground as we enter. That's so silly and pointless, but the devs had some humour when they made this mode. Something a lot more substantial to me personally is after that we get to go to this window, which normally shows us the outside and our character comments on the situation. Here we don't get that, and instead the annoying crows fly in here just to mess you up. I love it. On either mode, this whole revisit to the mansion highlights the differences between Jill and Chris quite a bit. Jill gets a few more options here on how she proceeds to the basement, all thanks to the best boy, Barry. Jill and Barry are having their own adventures that intersect quite a bit, and it reaches its best moments here. Whereas Chris is a lonely boy whose guardian angel Rebecca comes up whenever he messes up a boss fight. I like both approaches, but I just want to applaud the developers for making it feel substantially different here, when Chris is forced to do areas out of order compared to Jill, who had Barry's help. Anyway, after clearing out this mansion, we're in the final stretch. We have 2 areas left, both of which are brand new and very climactic. There's the underground caverns with some tedious sections I'm glad we can mash through to skip on the DS, and it's complete with fun cliches like a boulder that chases you, and less fun cliches like giant spiders. Partly for my sanity, this is an incredibly easy boss, probably the easiest in the game, which feels wrong considering its placement. It's here we learnt someone betrayed us, but I'm sure most players stopped caring about the story long ago. Before I go any further, I just need to bring up the elephant in the room. I should have brought it up earlier, but I didn't feel like it, but now I'm forced to because it's on my mind, and my keyboard doesn't have a backspace, or arrow keys, or even my computer doesn't have a mouse. Resident Evil 1 and its immediate sequels are hard for people to get into. They're called dated because they don't play conventionally, like what most games do today, or have done for a couple decades really. But this is a feature. Moving around threats isn't meant to be super easy or fast, shooting is meant to be deliberate with a wind-up animation, complete with the inability to move while aiming. It's a game where surviving is meant to be a challenge you push through. But I also know people will ignore that, say I'm defending a game that's bad with the argument that it's meant to be bad. So just to speak broadly, please don't judge games by if they feel natural at first. Learn them, adapt to them, see the specific feeling games can go for when they're not shackled to what's expected. Gameplay doesn't age, we just get too comfortable and aren't willing to give them a chance. And this happens to lots of games. People just need to give games more chances. And if for some reason you still can't wrap your head around these controls, the remake on current gen lets you play off traditional movement, so play that I guess, even if it makes me cry. I mean, that version doesn't have the DS exclusive feature of touching characters and having them react. It's cute when you're doing things like bopping their head, but unfortunately the developers were horny, and this mostly boils down to touching their butt or their breasts. Damn, these developers weren't subtle at all. We even get a stripper cop uniform for Jill, and cheerleader for Rebecca. God, what's wrong with your hand, Rebecca? After exiting the underground caverns, we make it to the end game, a secret facility hidden below everything. The mood is entirely different here. It's sterile, it's cold, it's modern. It's a wonderful contrast to the warmer mansion with its antiquated furniture, or the dank caverns we just escaped. And best of all, we get my favourite enemies here, these naked abominations that still make me uncomfortable now, just with their noises and featureless appearance. It's like someone dipped an Ocarina of Time Redead in bleach. But just to avoid the comment correcting me, Rebirth introduced me slightly earlier in a tonally out-of-place area, and just goes to show how careful you have to be with enemy placement. Even if it's a fun moment on its own, it just feels wrong seeing these guys anywhere besides this lab. A lot of your time here is dedicated to using computers or other tech to read discs. And I gotta say, I love the first-person computer view here, but god do I hate this keyboard layout. Alphabetical order is a lot less jarring when it's something like a name entry screen. It puts me off when it's a touch interface trying to resemble a keyboard. But on the other hand, it's funny, so I can't complain. Rebirth does quite a bit to change the environment here, sometimes for the better, like these crawling enemies, or the mix-ups of these rooms here. But there is one change that completely ruins this for me, and it's related to a knife minigame. Normally, this small room here, you have to do a U-turn in to access the computer, and it's filled to the brim with these naked guys. It's tense and it's claustrophobic, probably the best room in the entire game for when it comes to making you feel helpless. And this comes at a point when you're normally killing things effortlessly. It's just here the number of them and the small space you're in is the real challenge. It's rewarding to beat them and get to that computer. But here in Rebirth we just do a knife fight, and when we're done, we have a completely empty room with no threats. What a buzzkill. But this does have a darts minigame, so this room is still perfect in my eyes. A change seemingly going the same way is the room I alluded to earlier. Normally, this small section of the endgame is the only area the ceiling climbing chimera are located. It's here to throw you off balance and give you an enemy that it's best to outrun. Though on Rebirth these guys are a familiar sight, we get a shake up with their placements. One room has none of them at all, which felt deflating. They sucked attention out of this one room. That is until you go to the next room and it's reversed. This normally quiet and calm room with objects to interact with now has these guys in it instead. Now I know you're supposed to kill them, but thankfully they're polite enough to let Chris or Jill do a touchscreen puzzle before resuming their fatal attacks. Also, just while on the changes here, there is a single enemy placement that I outright can't stand on Rebirth, even if it's probably a non-issue for most. If we make it to the facility's second save room without dealing with the enemies in the preceding room, we immediately exit to the camera being obscured by the foreground zombie. Worst of all, another zombie is right by the door and will attack us even though we can't see any of this. So I guess don't go into the save room immediately. Deal with the threats first, unless you want to suffer like I did. But with that, the game ends on a whimper. Like, we have a cool story sequence for those invested, but the final boss goes down without a problem. But you know, it's the journey, not the destination. Never mind, because the game picks up immediately. Sirens are blaring, and we have to backtrack out of this facility, and we can either rescue Jill or Chris, you know, whichever one we're not playing as. Things are already building up, but then we have a self-destruction timer forcing us out of here quickly with an epic escape sequence. And then it concludes with the final boss reappearing for round 2. This time it's a fight against the clock, with an appropriate climactic flair to make it feel, for a lack of a better word, epic. This culminates with a rocket launcher to finish him off, and then the ending plays. They really stuck that landing. It never gets tiring, even if them calling Jill an Amazon is silly. After all this, we're given a timer, showing us how long it took to beat the game. It's a tangible high score that you'll want to beat, and you are rewarded for doing so. But we get another massive incentive to replay the game. Dress up! Now we can play the game again, but let the characters wear different outfits. I promise this is an exciting reward. We get the original timeless outfits from the original release, but they're also joined by the DS newcomers, like the horny outfits, or Chris being a ninja. These aren't really my cup of tea. It's no director's cut, unfortunately. But there is an attention to detail here that I adore. Rebecca's cheerleader outfit replaces her knife with a pom-pom. I can't help but admire that. Unfortunately, none of these costume changes are reflected in the first-person knife mode. I didn't expect that. It's a small issue, but I'm sure it ruined one person's time with the game. And while that's an end to the main game here, there's still more on this little cartridge. We have a local multiplayer mode which lets us play as a bunch of characters, including some deceased Bravo team members. It must have been really satisfying for longtime fans to finally get the opportunity to play as these guys. There are 2 modes here, but I can't play them, so I won't dwell on them too long. Unfortunately, the amount of people in the 2020s that not only have their DS ready, but also have copies of this increasingly hard to find game is very small. But from what I have seen others say, it seems like this was a mode that had its fans. If it wasn't obvious, I really enjoy Resident Evil 1, and I like all its permutations. The original, the director's cut, the other director's cut, the remake, and especially the cancelled Game Boy Color version. And yes, I know that version has subtitles. I wasn't making a mistake earlier, it just wasn't finished or released. But there's a charm of the original that I find unmatched, even with its many sequels, and seeing it crammed onto the DS and crunched down to the smaller scale is a joy to me. It being better in some ways is the icing on the cake, but you know, even if this version was worse across the board, I'd still be singing its praises. I'm biased. But here, we have a nearly definitive version of the game, and it has gameplay improvements from its sequels like quick turnaround, tactical reloading, and a dedicated knife button. But it never gave up the identity of Resident Evil 1. My biggest issue with the game is how it looks on modern displays, which, as I covered, wasn't the developer's fault. Like everything else in life, it was the fault of Nintendo. They're the ones that made the screen so horrible in the first place. Anyway, just isolate those last couple sentences, and that's my summary for many games, with the chief example being Donkey Kong Country for Game Boy Advance. But there was at least another way to see Donkey Kong be stunningly beautiful on the GBA, and that's what I'll cover next time. DK King of Swing, a side game from Japanese studio Payon, and it's all about swinging on pegs, and it's complete with absolutely phenomenal sprite work. I hope to convert you to our weird little cult of people who adore the 2 Donkey Kong peg-based games. Yeah, this game even got a sequel.